All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. My name is Michael Youngborg. I'm the Associate Director for Student Accountability and Restorative Practices here at Towson. And in this session this afternoon, we're going to talk a little bit about a restorative jumpstart, right? So we're going to focus on that second half of my office name, the restorative practices piece, and talk a little bit about some strategies for community building, thinking about membership engagement, things like that. We're also going to talk a little bit about responsive work and things like that of how you might address conflict. Before we jump into the actual agenda, just to talk a little bit about what my office does. We do manage the Code of Accountability. So all of those standards and guidelines that you all are kind of expected to adhere to as students at the university. But over and above that, right, we think about you all as one big community, right? We're all in this community together. What does that look like? What expectations are we bringing into the table? How do we work together? Kind of, in some cases for you all, live together if you're living on campus or even thinking about living off campus with roommates. And specifically for today, right? Like thinking about all of your organizations, all of the wonderful work that you do. What does it look like to be in community with those people? And again, have different goals in mind, have different expectations. And for you as leaders, right? What does it look like to kind of lead a group of people, bring them together, have a level of both support and accountability and ultimately engagement for the folks that you're sort of bringing into the spaces that you're working with. And so today we're going to go over kind of broadly speaking, all of these different categories, starting with thinking about community agreements. So again, that kind of high level, we're coming together either for the first time or we're coming back together after some time away. What does that look like? How do we kind of readjust, reset, or get things set up for the first time? We're going to talk a little bit about fair process and inclusive decision making. And so that's going to kind of tie into how do you think about making decisions and kind of getting buy-in and kind of making the hard choices that you might have to make sometimes as a leader and ultimately as a group. Getting into some communication skills with affective statements, talking about some practical tools that you might use beyond that for community building and listening circles. And again, we're going to talk a little bit about responding to potential conflict and things like that. As we go through today, I'm going to stop at a couple points for just some questions to kind of engage and get you all thinking and talking about some ideas that you may have. Feel free to always unmute for those sections. And even throughout, if you have questions, feel free to unmute and just interrupt me and ask. Or I have the chat up as well. I'm going to do my best to look over as I'm talking. Feel free to either throw things in the chat as questions, or if you are participating and there's something that you want to answer as I'm asking those questions, you can feel free to do that there as well. Okay, so to get into kind of, again, the outset, right? Community agreements. Relatively straightforward stuff, but ultimately it's about creating those guidelines, those standards, those expectations for yourselves as a group. And this is an area where you can think about kind of full member participation. This is not necessarily like an executive board activity of like, hey, this is our charter, this is like our kind of broad goals and things like that. No, these are kind of like, we have all of us coming together. How do we want to function, right? What are our expectations for everyone, right? What does participation look like? What does it mean to be a member of whatever group this is? What are you expecting people to bring to the table? And specifically, you might have expectations for those executive board members, right? And kind of thinking of this question of like, what is the board on its own expected to do? And how are they communicating with general membership? Community agreements may also extend to things like event planning, right? Like the who, what, when, where, how, and also gathering feedback, right? So this is everything from maybe setting up like, how do you plan to send out like regular communication? Are you doing that via email? Is it like a WhatsApp thing? Like, what are you using to communicate? What's the expectation for maybe response time in business days or whatever if folks have questions for the executive board? When you're thinking through event planning or just in general kind of logistical things, how you're setting things up to be broken down, what does that look like functionally, right? And also gathering feedback, right? Community agreements are not just this thing of like you're creating a list of like, hey, this is just a series of like items that we're going to tick off and we're going to say these are community agreements. If something goes wrong, it goes wrong, we'll address it. And that's that. And it can never change. Absolutely not, right? Like these things are dynamic. They should be changeable. They should be adaptable year to year. Ideally not day to day, right? But like if you are coming across issues and you're like, gosh, this just fundamentally isn't working. This thing that we said we wanted to agree to just isn't realistic, right? Like maybe there was an idea of like, we're going to check in, we're going to have like a weekly newsletter or whatever. And either, nobody has time to make that, or maybe you do have time to make it and people just feel like it's too much, it's too often, right? Like you can revisit those expectations for what you have for yourself. And if you're not living up to them, that's not an indictment against you as a person or as a community necessarily, but maybe it's a time to just evaluate what does that look like and what are your needs as a group as you think through what those agreements are and what's helpful for you. And so ultimately, as I talked about, right, like this is a process, this is a piece of your time as an organization to think about what does this mean for everyone, right? Allowing everyone to kind of come to the table and share what it means for them to be a part of your group or your organization and to really express what they want to get out of it and what they're willing to bring to the table, right? And you can kind of set up some clear expectations, some clear boundaries for what that participation actually means. That's a really early way to also sort of get buy-in from people, right? Just kind of real simple way of saying like, hey, this is what we're about as an organization. These are kind of overarching goals. Like this is the reason we're coming together, like kind of big picture wise. Now, when we think about how does that work on a day-to-day basis, what do you want from this group, right? Like what do you want out of this? And that's something that goes both ways, right? It's not just saying like, hey, what do you want out of this? Like, what does this general membership want from us as an executive board? It's what do we want from each other, right? Like you're working together. And that's why it's really important to think about these agreements and what kind of those operations and kind of overarching goals look like for you as a whole group versus just saying like, nope, I as an individual or us as a small team are going to set all these standards for the group, you know, get in or get out. No, that's probably not the best way to go about doing this, right? Kind of being able to sit down early on in the semester or when you're coming back together for the first time and just kind of have that general meeting to say like, okay, let's revisit or visit for the first time maybe. What is it that we actually want from this group and from each other? And how are we going to hold each other accountable, right? Again, it's not just setting up those agreements and saying, here's a list. It's first of all, understanding that those things can change. And second of all, talking about what happens if someone doesn't adhere to one of those agreements? What does accountability look like, right? So those agreements, those accountability conversations are just as much a part of those agreements as the standards that you set. So kind of important things to think about as you go through. So this will be the first time I'm just going to ask for y'all to share out. And again, feel free to unmute if you would like, or to just put things into the chat. But when you think about this concept of community agreements, what are some common agreements that you have found that you've used or that you feel like you might want to use in your different groups or organizations? Any thoughts?
I mean, I would say in my organization, we just do kind of like a simple have one person speak at a time because sometimes things could get rowdy when multiple people are trying to give opinions.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point, right? Like a kind of method or a way of like this is the way that we're going to speak, right? Like speak without interruption, right? Like don't interrupt other people when they're speaking. That's a great start. Anybody else? Any other kind of one or two other things?
An agreement that I've used in my organization, I hope to use in my organization, and I've used in other organizations, is sort of leaving everything outside of this moment, outside the door, because everyone has a lot of stress going on of like classes, personal life. You never know what's going on in someone's life, but sort of leaving that at the door so that when you're here, you can just focus on what you're doing and everyone can focus on what they're doing, to try to keep a very professional environment.
Great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? Like setting some boundary for like, yes, you have a lot going on. We all have lives, but for the purposes of like our organization, the business that we're doing, we're going to focus on that. We're going to do that here. I see in the chat as well, board member communication, especially if they won't be at meetings. Again, that makes a lot of sense, transparency and things like that. Some other examples, these are all great things. These are things that like we use as professional staff as well, kind of listening without interruption, things like that. Open communication, transparency. Again, I see also promoting communication, wanting everybody to speak their minds, emphasizing listening. And I really do appreciate the kind of leaving kind of things at the door and focusing on business. And then on the flip side of that, one of the agreements that we have a lot of the times in our office is that sometimes it's okay to make time for fun, right? But it's also about understanding what those boundaries are, right? Like sometimes you do need to get down to business, and sometimes there is a little bit more room for fun. And I think being able to articulate what those things are and when those times are can be really helpful for you. Some of these things you just may not think about, right? Like you might be like, oh, like this is an unspoken rule. And sometimes those unspoken rules can create some tension or some friction, especially if you're bringing new folks into a space and they haven't been there before. So it really helps to kind of put those things out loud. Again, that's another thing we've sort of had a conversation about as professional staff, right? Like we have these unwritten rules of student affairs, but what does that actually mean? And why are they unwritten, right? Like, why can't we talk about them? And it's not that we can't talk about them. It's just that there's a lot of things that maybe people accept coming into a group, an organization, a workplace that like, this is the way things are done. And that's that. And I appreciate you all bringing up the point of wanting people to be able to speak their minds, maintaining open communication, focusing on the kind of business of the organization at hand, because it sounds like that'll give you that solid foundation of actually kind of laying everything out on the table so that you can actually get the things done that you need to get done versus just kind of arguing about things or kind of getting tripped up over, all of this different stuff, right? And that's ideally what you see here is that this is useful for your time, right? Like this might feel like a kind of belabored conversation. It's like, okay, come on, like we all know why we're here. We're here for the same reason. But it can be really helpful to talk about that and kind of put it all out there for everyone so that there is an understanding because maybe somebody is confused and they're afraid to speak up. And this can give them an opportunity to maybe hear someone else that like, hey, I need this agreement that like when I'm feeling stressed out, I need for it to be okay for me to get up and step out of the room for a minute. And maybe that's something that you can all agree on because maybe the focus has been like, we're on business, we need everyone in the space, this is super intense, but maybe that's too much for people. And sometimes maybe they need to get up and take a step away. So again, these agreements can be all across the board. There's no dumb ideas, right? Like this is truly about what do you need? And that's, I think, the first thing we always say as professional staff in our agreements. I think the top agreement that always comes out, whether it's in my team or working with other teams on campus, is just take care of yourself, right? Like do what you need to do to take care of yourself because you do need to be able to show up in a way that is authentic and able to focus on that business that y'all are needing to do as an organization or a group. Okay. So we're thinking about those community agreements. We're thinking about what does it look like to come together and to function as a group. I want to talk now about this other concept of fair process, which you may have heard of, or alternatively, we talk about it as inclusive decision making. And so really this is kind of a thought process and a way of, right there in the name, making decisions. And so what this really asks you as leaders to do, what it asks your entire group to do, is to think about who all of your stakeholders are. And to, as we've kind of got it highlighted, asterisks, all kind of bolded out here, involve those stakeholders in co-creating the decision-making process. And so what's really helpful here is to be able to clarify what roles are in decision making, because what it's not, on the other hand, it is not abdicating your decision making authority as a leader, as an executive board. It is not necessarily popular vote or democracy, although it's okay to hold a vote to determine things. But ultimately, there might be things where that's not appropriate, right? Like you might be up against university policy where people might want to do things differently, but you have to make a decision that is in line with a policy. And part of fair process is hearing people out and understanding why they want the things that they want. And as a leader, being able to engage with them, understand that understand their feedback and having them feel heard. And then also being able to explain, okay, these are the kind of boundaries of the decision that we're able to make, right? Because there are going to be those times where it's a little bit more challenging. You're not necessarily going to be able to be like, well, 60% of the people want to do this, so we're going to do it, right? Like you have to think about all of these different components of, you're an organization that are beholden to certain rules and regulations from the university. You only have so much time in your days as students with real lives, I'm assuming jobs, classes, other extracurriculars, multiple organizations, all of the things that you do, right? Like realistically, your time is limited. And you're also sort of working within the bounds of different sort of organizational and structural things within the university. So when you actually think about how this plays out, though, it's easy, I think, to kind of break fair process down into kind of these three different components. And we sort of started to talk about them, but hopefully this will explain it a little bit more so. When you think about engaging in this, right, like thinking about who your stakeholders are, bringing them to the table to be a part of that decision-making process, That's the engagement piece, right? Involving people in decisions that affect them by listening to their views and genuinely taking their opinions into account, right? So it's one thing to kind of like say like, no, we can't host this event because it's, after hours and it's like against university policy. We can't reserve the space this late. But we want to do it anyway because we feel like that's the best time for our event, right? Like you can't just go ahead and decide like, okay, people want to hold the event late, so we're going to hold the event late. This is an area where it's like, well, no, we understand that like this works best for people because of X, Y, and Z reason. But we've talked to ECS. We know that we're only able to reserve the spaces between X and Y hours. And so kind of bringing that back to the table to hear people's opinions, kind of go through that process of maybe being frustrated that you can't do a certain thing and being able to have a discussion about like, okay, we understand that's where we are. I'm feeling that frustration. This is sort of the process that we're working with. And that's where the explanation piece starts to come in, right? Describing the reasoning behind the decision to everyone who's been involved or who's been affected by it. So again, coming back to this, where it's not necessarily popular vote, you're not necessarily hearing everyone out and everyone gets what they want. You're hearing everyone out. You're offering an explanation for why a decision has been made. What are the boundaries that you're working within, and sort of how we move forward with that. And expectation clarity, right? Like once that decision has been made, and let's say it is around event planning or whatever, understanding that everyone understands what's expected of them in the future, right? Like what role is everyone playing in here? Who's making the reservation? Like who's working on catering? Who's doing publicity, marketing, right? Like all of the social media stuff. Who's inviting people? What does all of that look like as we've now come to this decision? And kind of like the not so serious example we use to kind of dig into this is like, let's say you are like trying to figure out how to feed everyone, right? Like, and you figure out that, okay, pizza seems like the best option. And you're trying to have a discussion around like, okay, what do we want to have? Like we can order 3 pizzas, right? Like we know that some people are vegetarian. And so we know that we want to have like a vegetarian pie. We know that some people are like, I don't know, allergic to onions. And so maybe we can't have onions, even though someone is really like, I really want onions on pizza. It's my favorite topping. But it's going to cause someone to go into like anaphylactic shock if onions are in the room, right? Maybe a bad example, but like a nut allergy, that doesn't really work with pizza. But just something that is like going to be a danger or a threat to someone, right? Like, and it's in this kind of like weird, odd example that you can see. There's going to be a lot of conflicting opinions about what people want to eat. Some of those things are going to be like hard and fast rules, like, no, I'm allergic. I can't eat this thing. Others are going to be preferences of like, I don't really like a plain cheese pizza, but like I can understand that maybe that's the best option because we have some allergy issues. We have some issues where people don't or can't eat meat for different reasons, and so this is why we're going to go with this choice, right? And so you can see that this whole conversation, all of these different parts, take a role, right? That engagement piece of kind of asking people what they want, getting that feedback of like, I can or cannot have this thing. I do or do not have these preferences. Being able to kind of explain like, okay, we're going to go with these 3 choices because we know we have some allergies. We know this option is going to, be amenable to, a number of people. You're not going to get exactly what you want, but this is still something that you can eat and you do kind of like, and maybe in the future we can do something different. And expectation clarity, right? Like everyone's going to eat. Somebody's got to order the pizza, right? Like this is really simple. You're probably not getting to this level of depth of conversation around pizza. But if you kind of take this out and again, think about event planning or the process of determining what you're going to do with the budget that you have, spending and things like that, being able to kind of work through, this is what we want to do in a given semester, kind of engaging people in that conversation and understanding what are the boundaries that you're working within. Again, what are the limits on your time as people? What are the limits that you have based on university regulations and things like that? And honestly, being able to have a conversation, hear out those frustrations, right? Like not silence people who are upset, right? Like you do want to be able to hear people out, obviously in a kind of like civil and open manner, right? Like we don't need to have shouting matches and whatnot, but like, and again, this is where you can come back to those community agreements of like not interrupting people, wanting to encourage people to speak their minds and speak up and communicate openly. And so kind of early on, having those community agreements are another kind of part and parcel of this fair process piece, because it can allow you to set up what the boundaries of this conversation around decision-making ultimately looks like, right? And so again, I kind of talked through this example already. Not everyone's going to get what they want with pizza, but that doesn't mean that fair process was not observed. Just because you don't get the onions on the pizza doesn't mean that fair process was observed, right? Like you kind of said your piece. We know that we can't have that for whatever reason because somebody's allergic, and that's that, right? Like back to the event example. It's like we want to have the event at 11 p.m., but we know we can't reserve a space at 11 p.m. Here's why. These are the reasons. This building is closed. There's no staff. Okay, let's come back to the table and talk about other options, right? Like just because you don't get that 11 p.m. reservation or those onions on the pizza doesn't mean that you didn't engage in inclusive decision making. It just means that ultimately not everyone's going to get what they want. But you're going to balance those budgetary needs, you're going to balance those needs and wants of the group against what those university regulations are, all of those different pieces that you can sort of think about. And so as you think about this broadly for yourselves as a process that you might use, I'm going to give you a couple minutes to think about this and kind of put it into the chat or speak up. Feel free to unmute. But where might you use these principles in your organizations? And or what challenges do you think you might encounter in trying to do so?
I was thinking maybe some of these principles can apply during like board meetings when maybe trying to set up some events, or maybe one member is not doing their part and the group has to come to a consensus about what to go moving forward with that board member.
Mhm.
Or maybe getting some, even with the club members, getting some individual feedback about different events that happened and trying to see how we can improve it in the future. Maybe like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like getting feedback on events, thinking through like what have we done, what do we want to do, what works, what doesn't work. We've got like in the chat setting up meeting dates. Somebody looks like they had some similar ideas to what was already said. That's great too. And deciding on future meeting themes, all these types of things, right? These are all areas where you can kind of engage with your executive board and your kind of general membership. And then it says, I don't want to accidentally mislead people. I'm aware that there are some situations that don't need a majority vote, but I'm not always sure which ones count. That's a good point. And Jenna, you don't have to, but do you want to unmute and kind of explain, like say a little bit more about that? You can say no if you don't want to.
Well, like one of those things is like trying to figure out which day we should like have our general meetings.
Mhm.
Like it's like not I try to like figure out what works for everyone. Not everyone votes, and
Gotcha.
have to kind of figure it out myself. And
Mhm. Yeah, that can be a challenge, right? Like if you're trying to go through this process and you're not getting the participation, right? Like you might be sort of meaningfully engaging in that and not getting back what you need from folks, it sounds like.
yeah,
Okay. Oh, sorry. Was there more you were going to say, Jen?
no,
No.
it's
Okay.
fine.
Okay. And so yeah, that's a good point to remember is one, you may be asking for feedback and not getting it, but two, you might also have decisions that ultimately are going to be tough to make, yet still like seemingly simple. Like, yes, what is the date of the meeting? Because again, we talked about it before, right? Like y'all have different class schedules, different work schedules, different lives. It's going to be tough to find a time that works for literally everyone. And so there might be some compromise in there where, not everybody's going to get what they want. And maybe that might mean that, some people are not able to be at every single meeting, but that's okay because ultimately for the good of the group and for the good of what you need to get done, the meeting needs to happen at a certain date or a certain time. All right. Kylie, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, super quick. While you were talking, I was thinking for our club group, we kind of had this situation recently when we were trying to figure out our club time because
Mhm.
we were trying to figure out when e-board could meet, when members could come, and then also our club advisors are also the clinical supervisors for speech pathology. So it's a lot of conflicting schedules. And
Mhm.
so we ended up picking a time that works for e-board and the clinical supervisors. And then when we shared the time, we said, but if you can't make the meetings, we also have a Zoom option. And then we also listed the ways that they can be involved if they can't come to the meetings. So like, here are our social events. Here's how you can keep up with fundraisers and any events that we're doing outside of the meeting times, which I feel like helps people be a little less stressed out if they're like, oh, I can't come to any meetings because I'm in class.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that's an excellent example of kind of going through all of those steps of like, okay, these are the boundaries of what we're working in. We know this isn't going to work for everyone. But again, you're kind of going through that process of explaining kind of the why, the how, the what. You're also offering these other options that are going to allow people to remain engaged. I mean, you're setting some expectations, right? Like, we don't expect for you to be at all of these meetings, but you're invited, you're able to come. Also, here are all of these other options, Zoom option, here are other ways to be engaged. So yeah, I think that's a great example of kind of engaging in a fair process where, again, it may not be that everyone's getting exactly what they want, but it is a fair process, right? Like, you have heard people out, you've understood what people want and need, and ultimately you're coming to a decision one way or another. So, all right. Thank you all for kind of sharing your thoughts there. We're going to move to our next thing here. And so kind of some general communication thoughts and tools now. I think this is probably going to be something that sounds familiar to most, if not all of you. But just kind of when you think about, again, maybe one of your community standards is that you want to emphasize people trying to communicate in, with affective statements when possible or when appropriate. And ultimately, affective statements are also what we call I statements, right? These are things that are not just an organizational tool or a leadership tool, but also just sort of a way to communicate in everyday life. An idea of maybe being less judgmental and being more open with your feelings. And so we have this formula we've kind of put together or that we've used from other resources. Again, it's not always going to sound like this, but what it does allow you to sort of center is you're centering your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions versus saying like, you did X, right? You're saying like, I feel, I notice, I see, I hear, right? Like, you're starting with an evaluation or an observation, right? Like, you're not judging, you're not labeling, you're kind of seeing or recognizing something that's happening. Then you're sort of expressing your feelings, right? Like, having a sort of empathetic response, being honest with what you are observing, right? Like, maybe it's somebody who's kind of late to meetings. It's like, hey, I noticed that you've been showing up so late to meetings, right? And maybe your feelings or your thoughts are that you're like, I'm worried because we have a lot to get done. Your contributions are important, and I'm concerned that we won't have enough time to get through everything if you're not here on time. And again, moving into that next part of the formula, right? Expressing a need, what values determine your needs, right? It's like, hey, I value your input, and I value our organization's ability to kind of get through our meetings in a timely manner, and making a request for the future. Hey, in the future, are you willing to or able to kind of leave a little bit earlier to show up on time, right? And this is only one side of the story, right? Like, this is you kind of noticing something, and it's, again, expressing how you feel, and what you need from that. And what you may get back is like, hey, yeah, like, I hear you, I understand. I've been really stressed out lately. Like, I've been super busy with class and with homework, and I just haven't felt like I've been able to make it on time. And maybe it opens up a conversation, right? Like, you're expressing a kind of a level of vulnerability in what you're saying. And it also invites and opens up the other person to talk about that as well. So it could be as simple as like, yep, we're gonna talk through this. That's a request. Great. Like, yep, I can do that in the future. Thanks for your feedback. Thanks for sharing. Might open up a deeper conversation to kind of talk about things that have been going on. And again, I kind of started this with a negative example. It doesn't necessarily have to be that, right? Like, affective statements can also be in the positive, right? Like, you can say like, hey, like, I noticed like you've been working really hard on planning this event. Like, I feel grateful for your like participation here. Like, I value kind of the like energy and the vibe that you bring to this. Like, hey, just keep it up, right? Like, and let me know if you need any help, right? Like, again, it doesn't need to be something where it's like, I noticed this thing, I'm angry, I'm upset. It can be any sort of emotion, anything that sort of works for you or you think about, right? And that's where this sort of idea of this feelings wheel comes in, right? Like, we've got kind of the center kind of primary emotional response. Maybe this is like your gut feeling, the immediate thing that you feel upon something happening. we move out into these secondary and tertiary examples, these are kind of like your emotions or your thoughts and feelings maybe developing over time, right? Like maybe your immediate thing is you feel happy, right? And maybe the happiness is a result of like being peaceful and then therefore thankful because that event we've been talking about went off without a hitch. It was super successful. You had 1 million people show up. It was super popular. It went off, and it was so awesome, right? So like you're at peace and you're thankful for that happening, right? Maybe you are feeling angry. And why are you feeling angry? Maybe on the other hand, you feel a little bit let down and resentful because only one person showed up and all they did was grab food and leave, right? Like there could be any other angle or any other number of emotions that you might feel. But again, just kind of thinking through this list of words, I think that's ultimately what this is, more so than, necessarily having to go through that, like, okay, this is my primary, or this is my secondary emotion, right? This is just sort of a list of like words and tools that maybe start to articulate the way that you're feeling about something, and maybe put into practice just some of those thoughts and feelings around, something that's happened. And again, it might be as simple as like, hey, maybe you at the beginning of the semester are leading like the community agreements, and somebody, gives you a really good idea to include, and you're saying like, hey, thanks for sharing your idea. That is amazing. Like, I feel really grateful, right? Because you were able to speak up and let us know what you needed. I value that open communication. And I hope to, continue that in the future, right? All of those things, again, positive, negative, in between. Hopefully, this is just a tool for you to kind of think through using with your organization, and again, in daily life. And I'm sure you are, right? Like we all are at times asked to or want to, or maybe not, right? Like it can be an anxious feeling thing where we maybe don't want to talk about our emotions, but there's a lot of opportunity to do that. And it's also an opportunity to open up that level of vulnerability that invites someone else to engage in that same level of conversation with you. And so, yeah, just again here, a couple of questions for you. Where do you feel like you already might be using affective statements? And where else do you think that they could be helpful in the work that you do with your student organizations?
So far, I mean, I've been using these statements, not, beat for beat, but just in describing my
Mhm.
expectations for my board. Just to, letting them know, like, because we only have three board members, a treasurer, president, and event coordinator, um, we have to make sure that everyone has to do their specific task. Like the event coordinator really needs to handle planning these events. And yes, I can help as needed.
Mhm.
But that's not really my department.
Yeah.
I have to make sure I submit attendance. I have to make sure I run these club meetings. I have to make sure that the social media is being promoted. There's no room coordinator, so I have to make sure I'm doing the 25 live training, submitting the
Mhm.
room, and then the treasurer has to make sure they keep a hold of their funds. And so I'm really letting them know, like, hey, I can help with your things as well, but I really have my own things I need to focus on, and we need to make sure we're all in our specific niche consistently.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think that's a great example. And I appreciate what you said about it's not always beat for beat, right? Like we've got this kind of complicated 4-part formula, right? Like you're not always going to go through every single one of these parts. But the value of this is understanding that like the kind of impact and the vulnerability that it can sort of belie is in being able to articulate some or all of these things, right? Like whatever behavior you're observing, what feelings you're having, and kind of the needs or the plans or the requests kind of going forward. So again, yeah, you're not always going to say all of these words exactly in this order, but kind of starting with that kind of framework of I'm speaking from an I perspective, is really valuable, in that level of communication. And hopefully what you're seeing here kind of throughout is like these things are tied together, right? Like setting expectations, right, from the get-go in those community agreements, being open and transparent and communicating throughout, fair process, right? Being engaging, setting expectations, explaining things clearly, and in doing so, using those affective statements and inviting others to do the same. So, okay. So, what are some strategies, right? Like we've talked about some tools, the fair process, inclusive decision making, community agreements, affective statements, just kind of as a general thing. What are some other strategies you might use to kind of put that into practice? So one or two things here really are different kind of circling tools. And this is a big thing you'll hear, like if you work with our office or you work with other folks who are kind of doing restorative practices work, is just this kind of ability to use a circle. And so ultimately, just before I make sure I don't talk about it now, but the structure of a circle is just that, right? You're literally sitting in a circle. And it might feel awkward the first time, especially if you haven't done it before. But ideally, this is a structure that invites kind of open conversation and communication. You know, there's typically a facilitator or multiple facilitators who are sort of leading the conversation, but who also might be a part of the group, but who are coming with a list of questions and things like that to talk about things, right? And so one of those options is to do a community building circle. And so that's as simple as having a conversation with a couple of talking points to form connections and build trust, right? So the primary goal there being to create positive social bonds. So literally, you can think of this almost like an icebreaker type scenario, right? Like you're not necessarily getting up and doing a lot of activities, but the activity is, hey, we're going to ask a couple of questions and we're going to go around and everyone's going to share a little bit about, you know, their own personal take on something. And ultimately, this doesn't even necessarily have to be a whole like independent thing as a circle. What we do every day in a staff meeting, not every day, right? But our kind of biweekly staff meeting as a SARP team is we have an opening and a closing question, right? Like, and for us, that's a big part of the community building that we do is just so that we're talking with each other about things that are going on. So like we had a staff meeting today. And because we're getting into the semester, like our opening question was like, hey, like what's one goal, intention, or, you know, thought that you have going into the semester that you really want to achieve, right? And like, so for me, like I just started serving on our staff senate at the university. So I was like, I want to really explore like this whole shared governance thing. I want to understand what the boundaries of that are and like, you know, what does actual like change look like from that perspective? You know, other people were sort of talking about like other pieces of their work. And it doesn't have to be like, you know, always work or organizational focused, right? Like we have also had opening questions be like, hey, what was your first concert? Or, you know, if you could travel anywhere in the world, like budget, like no budget in mind, like where would you go? That sort of thing. So again, it's a little bit about learning about each other, building some trust and some connection. And really those questions can be whatever you want them to be. And they can be in the context of the meetings. They can be their own activity. So, you know, you may have just a separate scheduled thing to be like, hey, like we've got a lot of new people or we're coming back together. We just want to take a minute to get to know each other a little bit better before we really jump into super serious work. So we're going to sit down, we're going to sit in a circle. We're all going to answer these questions. And kind of that's that, right? But remember, though, this is also where those community agreements can be super helpful. You know, if you have a set of agreements that you already use regularly, just being able to implement them as part of the community building circle and adding anything that you need. You know, one of the big ones probably being like, it's okay to pass if you don't have anything to say. And so things like that. And I'm looking at time. We're coming to the end. So I will kind of move a little bit through these so there's time for questions if there are any. Another option is like a listening circle. And so again, this is a series of maybe reflective questions that are allowing everyone to answer without the need for others to respond directly. And primarily that's for processing and creating a space for others to be heard. And so I've done one of these, you know, recently that was sort of about like processing stress, right? And so we had a series of questions around like things that feel stressful. How do we typically, you know, deal with stress when it comes up? Like, you know, and kind of just talking through thoughts and feelings about those things. But again, with a listening circle, there's not really a back and forth conversation, right? It wasn't like I was saying something and somebody was raising their hand and they're getting the talking piece that we're using and they're going to be like, hey, like, I appreciate that you said this. I also feel, well, there's not like a back and forth, right? And so ultimately, the goal of a listening circle isn't necessarily to make a decision, but it's to process maybe an impact or maybe to just think about something that's happened and give a space for people to talk, right? And the purpose of the circle is just for people to be able to share, again, without being judged and without the need for there to be a response or an answer directly back between people. You're not necessarily creating a dialogue in that space, but you are offering up an area where, you know, we've all been maybe mutually impacted by something, and it's just going to allow everybody a little bit of time to process and think through some things. Again, when could you use these? You know, if you're in your first meeting of the semester doing some community building, whether it's just asking a couple of questions at the beginning and the end, maybe you're doing check-ins during the regular semester, again, regular meetings or otherwise, just to check in and see how people are going or doing a little bit of a get to know you sort of thing. Same if you're getting new members to join. And again, if there's a need to process like a listening circle, maybe something has just happened that like, an event didn't go super well. Or you're trying to decompress about something that's just sort of affected you all. Maybe like you thought you were going to have a budget for something and you didn't, and people are upset, and you're like, hey, nobody's really mad at anybody here. We don't need to resolve any conflict, but we kind of just want a space to talk this out without really a need for a solution right now. So we're going to have a space to maybe vent about that a little bit and just listen, but in a more structured way, right? Okay. And so I talked a little bit about this already, but how do you actually do this, right? Like, as I mentioned before, there are facilitators, one, maybe two, maybe three, depending on how large the group is. As the facilitator or multiple facilitators, you want to have some questions or talking points going in. And it can help to use a talking piece. So that can be like any sort of item that you use. Like I have this like kind of like painted like wooden stone thing that I use sometimes, and we just kind of pass around. The talking piece is important because if you're holding it, you're the one that's speaking. It gives everyone else permission to listen. It can help to use like a soft thing, like this mini little potato, if you're going to throw stuff around the room, if you're going to like popcorn questions around. But again, ultimately, it's a way to allow one person to speak, kind of hold silence from everyone else. And for the person holding it, it's also for them to be able to create a point of silence or reflection if they just want to take a beat and take a minute. Sitting in a circle, obviously, the facilitator will start by asking a question or stating a talking point, passing the talking piece around for each member to have an opportunity to respond. And that talking piece can go around multiple times for the same questions if participants have something more that they want to share. And again, it can be as easy as going in around, like we're sitting in a circle and I'm like, hey, for this first question, I'm going to pass to my left, ask the question, I pass to my left. Or maybe you're like, hey, we just want to popcorn this around. So I ask the question and then I ask for people to kind of raise their hands, and then we'll pass the talking piece to whoever wants it or whoever needs it at that moment. It's really that simple, right? Like you don't have to overthink it, right? Like you can sit in a circle. Again, it might feel a little bit awkward, but if you come in with a little bit of preparation, a little bit of time, it can be really useful, right? One of the other areas to think about, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this right now, are responsive strategies, right? Like what happens if there's harm that's occurred? Specifically, first of all, what happens if there's harm between members, right? Like maybe there's a conflict, people have a disagreement, there's an argument about something doesn't go quite right, there's a little bit of friction. Maybe a circle is possible for things that impact the whole group. Maybe this was kind of like a blow up that happened in a general meeting. People are having some feelings about it, and everybody who's impacted and kind of directly or indirectly wants to sit down and talk about it. What that does do is it allows people who have caused harm and who have been harmed to kind of speak and share their experiences. And typically that's a kind of messy situation in that there's not usually just someone who has been harmed and someone who has done the harming. Usually it goes both directions, right? Like you have experienced harm and you have harmed someone else. And what this can also do is kind of open up a conversation for what needs to happen to make things right. Maybe you need to have a reset of expectations. Maybe there is a desire for an apology. Maybe there's another, like, I don't know, maybe the touch point was like, we're super mad about this because the communication about this thing came too late and we weren't able to do what we needed to do. Maybe part of that agreement to make things right is like, okay, it was my job to do that communication. I hear you. I'm really sorry that I didn't send it on time. In the future, I want to commit to sending this out, 2 weeks prior to this deadline that we know we have coming up. And kind of, again, having an open conversation about what everyone needs to be able to move forward. External harm, maybe, again, this is like a listening circle, a processing space, something outside of the group has affected everyone. You may want to invite external parties or just have discussion between the people that have been impacted just to kind of process and kind of understand what are you going through together as a group. Restorative questions, I'll do this real quick, right? Like these are kind of your basic questions to ask through a process. You're asking what happened. You're not necessarily asking someone to explain the why, right? You're just asking what happened, right? Talking through also, what are you thinking and feeling at the time that whatever event happened? Is there anything you've thought about since? Also, it's important to be able to identify impact, whether you're talking about how you have impacted someone else or how you have been impacted, and identifying who those people are and how that has happened. And again, having that conversation about what needs to happen to make things right, which is really important, right? That agreement for now, how do we move forward? Not just we've talked about it, but how do we sort of maintain this long term? And what does that look like as a group? So last thing I'll really say here is ask us for help, right? We're available to consult and facilitate circles. We can do community building. We can help with conflict resolution. we have this link to this restorative resolution or workshop request here that we can kind of reach out and we can meet with your group, and do some skill building with them that's a little bit more focused and tailored to your own needs. I have this restorative practices workshop series on here, which is not true right now. So don't write these down because we do not have these scheduled. If we do have workshops coming up, we will adapt and change and we'll send out news about that. But right now those dates are wrong because I did not update this. And we have a couple minutes left. Any final questions, concerns, thoughts, just kind of our contact information up here though, in the last couple minutes, anything else that y'all need? All right. Well, if the answer is no, I appreciate your time. Again, our information is up here. And once again, my name is Michael. I'm the Associate Director in SART. Feel free to reach out to us at this email address or this phone number. Come visit us. If you want to talk to me directly, I'm happy to help. Or, anybody here, we're all happy to help. But again, I appreciate your time. Good luck with the semester. Oh, I have one question from Ava.
Yes, I have a quick question.
Sure.
So, do you have any maybe advice? I mean, I'm sure all of the stuff that we talked about can be used. If you have two members in a group that already have some on a board that already have some previous animosity towards each other.
Mm-hmm.
I know that can happen for some people, and that's happened for me in the past. So I'm just wondering if maybe.
Yeah, I think that's part of if you're trying to kind of do some proactive work, maybe there's a sort of different type of circle processing that you can do.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you're doing it as a whole board, or maybe you're doing it between, those two people and maybe somebody else. But I think a very important part of that and a very important part of any responsive work is doing what we call pre-work meetings and making sure that people have opted into this conversation. And so say, for example, you brought this to me and you're like, hey, I've got these two people. I want to see if they want to have a conversation. The way that I would approach that is kind of work with you to understand what you know, kind of meet with those two people separately and understand where they are and their openness and willingness to be a part of that type of conversation. And assuming they're ready for that, then we can start to set those boundaries, right? It's like, okay, what would be the purpose of this conversation, right? Like, do we want to set some guidelines for how we want to work together as a group? And does it just need to be between the two of you? Or does this need to involve the whole executive board? And what's the comfort level there? So I think the answer really is it depends, but there are a lot of strategies that we could use to address that. We'd be happy to help facilitate that. It is an area where I think if you felt comfortable as a leader being like, hey, I've noticed this, I want to talk with each of you about what it looks like for us to all work together. What's your comfort level with that conversation? You could have that conversation on your own, but we would also be happy to facilitate that. And I think just to emphasize, being able to talk with people separately before you bring them together, I think is one of the key things that you should remember in that part of the process.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. All right. Any other quick questions at the end? Okay. All right. Again, thanks for your time. I think you're headed back somewhere else now. So I appreciate y'all. I know this is going to be recorded, so I'm sure that'll be shared with you. And take care. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, too.
Thank you so much.